All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Friday class. I see most of your name. Great, super helpful to have the name tags. I'm working on it. I'll get these down soon. Hope everyone's doing all right. Has some fun weekend plans. We've got a fun class planned for today. I'm going to try something a little bit different. We'll see how it goes. In advance of class today, you had some readings in your textbook, finishing up the histology readings, as well as a couple of the videos from our friend Hank Green. Any questions on anything coming into class? All right, well, let's go ahead and actually, let me check. Let's go ahead and dive into it. Here's today's agenda. If this works, there we go. We're going to start off with a quick review of epithelial cells. I just want to make sure everyone is clear on how we describe epithelial cells. And then we're going to get into the integumentary system. I'm going to offer a brief introduction of the system, basically the primary functions of your skin. And then we're going to do a small group activity where we learn about the dermis and the epidermis. Then if we get through that today, we'll work on the appendages of the skin, your hair, your nails, fun stuff like that. And we'll wrap up, and I've got a few reminders for you, including your first quiz, which is opening after class today. So with that in mind, we had a ticket out on an activity and a ticket out on Wednesday. And I asked you to draw pictures of these three types of cells. And I looked through these, and there's a few misconceptions, and I want to make sure we are clear about this. So I have an example here from one of you that did a nice job with this, although my blowing up of the picture isn't so nice. And your diagram should look like this. Simple cuboidal cells, remember, are very square shaped. But first of all, remember that we name our epithelial cells based on whether they are simple or stratified. Simple simply means there's a single layer. Stratified means there are multiple layers, right? So make sure you've got that first. Simple equals one layer. Stratified equals more than one layer. Then we name them based on their shape. And so here we've got simple cuboidal. You see a single row of cells and they're cuboidal. I'm not going to draw it. You can see it here. Now, stratified squamous, this is the one where I saw a lot of different kinds of drawings that weren't accurate. And specifically, I saw a lot of drawings that were either a single layer of cells or drawings that looked like this. You were drawing your squamous cells and you made your squamous cells look cuboidal like this. Note that your squamous cells are these kind of, essentially looks like a fried egg, right? It's this kind of shape that can be any different number of shapes, and it has this kind of raised area. That's the nucleus. So if you look at it from the top, it kind of looks like that. If you're going to look at it from the side, it maybe kind of looks like this. Right? And the nucleus can be in different places on there, and the shape can change, but the idea is that it's flat. Squamous means flat. And so you can see here these layers of flat cells because it's stratified, and see how they're kind of pancake shaped there. So that's important. I saw a lot of you not drawing that correctly. Question, yep.
Which assignments you marked the ticket out and stuff is missing? Do you want to sing that? Or?
And oh, is it in Blackboard, you mean? Yeah. Do you have a grade for it though? Does it tell you get 2 points? Yeah, ignore it. So Blackboard's dumb. Basically pay attention to the point totals. If you do, and actually this is a good reminder. If you complete a ticket out and you see that I've graded it and you have a 0, just shoot me an email. Once in a while we get a technical glitch or something like that. We can always update it and let you know, okay? That sound okay? Okay. Stratified squamous, okay, talking about that. And then simple columnar, remember columnar are just these, basically they're like cuboidal cells, but they're longer than they are wide, or taller than they are wide, I guess you could say. And they have a nucleus, it could be anywhere, but like that. And simple to a single layer. So I just want to make sure it's clear. I just want to make sure that's clear, because I saw a lot of incorrect drawings from your ticket out. What questions do you have for me about that?
For the first one, like, did that person draw it kind of like looking down instead of like across? Like, could you draw kind of like the simple columnar, but just the square shape.
Yeah, and so this is probably good. Yeah, that's a good question. This is probably a view kind of looking down on it. We see these simple cuboidal cells often in places where we have like filtration happening, places in the kidneys. And so you could draw it. This is kind of looking down. It's kind of odd. I guess I should clarify. It's a little odd that it's a square shape here. That's actually not the part that I want you to pay attention to. What I want you to pay attention to, that each of these cells is square shaped. Yeah, that's a good clarifying question. Thanks. So it's cuboidal, not because the whole big thing is a square, but because each of those little cells is square. Good question. Any others? Okay, so let's talk about the integumentary system. So this is, when I say the integumentary system, I'm referring to the skin plus all of the stuff associated with the skin, including your nails, your hair, your sweat glands, and your sebaceous glands. And I want to start off, give a brief introduction, as I mentioned, and then we'll move into the epidermis and the dermis, the two primary layers of the integumentary system. And then we'll talk a little bit about the appendages of the skin, and I'll wrap things up. So the big takeaway here is that the integumentary system is the skin plus stuff associated with the skin. And let's take a look at that in a little more detail. The skin is our largest organ, which is a little bit surprising. We don't normally think of the skin as an organ, and it accounts for about 7% of your body weight. Of course, that can vary depending on your body characteristics. It varies in thickness from about 1.5 to 4.5 millimeters. So to give you an idea, that's about, it can be about up to about 1/4 of an inch thick. So it's pretty thin. And it's divided into two primary layers, the epidermis and the dermis. So we're going to look at these in a lot more detail coming up. And then underneath the dermis, we have the hypodermis. Now, the hypodermis technically isn't part of the integumentary system. It's not part of the skin, but it's closely associated with those layers of the epidermis and dermis that are part of the skin. So we're going to talk about it in this context as well. So there's essentially two layers of the skin plus the hypodermis. So I want you to know the epidermis, dermis, hypodermis. Now go back to your Greek prefixes here. Epi means on top of. So epidermis is the layer on top of the dermis. So it's the most superficial. Then you've got your dermis, which actually comes from the word for skin, if I'm not mistaken. And then the hypo means under or below. And so that's the layer under the dermis. So you can remember the order there. The epidermis is composed of stratified squamous cells. So that's the drawing that you just saw up here, where you have these layers of these flat cells on top of each other. Whereas the dermis is composed of two kinds of connective tissue, the loose areolar and dense irregular connective tissue. And we'll get in more detail about those coming up, and you'll see examples of this in your lab next week as well. And finally, with the hypodermis, as I said, it's deep to the dermis, and it's it composed of connective tissue and a fatty layer as well. And I'll show you that in detail in a second. Now, it's important to note that your hair and your nails develop from these cells in your epidermis, and they develop during the fetal period. So those things are happening even before birth. Questions? Right, go ahead.
So the varying thickness of the skin, is that like varying across our body, or is like one person body the same thickness?
That's a great question. And the answer is yes to both. Your skin definitely varies in thickness across your body. So for example, the heels of your feet, the palm of your hands, the skin is much thicker there than in many other places. It also varies among people for different reasons, due to age, sex, usage as well. If you, for example, if you're out there, I don't know, raking fields with your bare hands every day, you're going to get calluses on your hand. That epidermal layer is going to get a lot thicker on your hands. It also changes across your lifetime as well. When you're young, babies have thinner skin relatively, especially newborns. The skin is very kind of sensitive. As you grow, you're an adult, it's generally thicker. However, when you get older, when you're elderly, that it becomes thinner again. And that's why I think we talked about this a little bit on Wednesday. You can scratch or bruise easily as you get older. That's a good question. That's another hand too. Sure.
So the hypodermis isn't part of the integumentary system.
Tech,
So,
yep.
are we going to learn about this more later? Or is this our one like shot at the hypodermis?
No, it's like a tag on. So it's not part of the system, but we're going to learn about it now anyway, because it's closely associated with it. And so it makes sense to cover it now. So we'll talk about this a little bit. I think I have this later in class today, if not today, Monday.
Okay.
We're going to lump them all together because it makes the most sense to talk about it in association with the integumentary system, which is technically just the epidermis and dermis there. Good. Other questions? You guys are asking good questions. I like it. All right. So I talked about that. Well, there you go. Actually, hypodermis. Just to answer your question, I set the lecture up perfectly. As I mentioned, it's deep to the skin and it's derived from the mesoderm. So remember that your skin, along with your nervous system, is derived from the ectoderm. We talked about those 3 primary germ layers of the developing embryo. The skin, the integumentary system, it derives from the ectoderm, whereas the hypodermis derives from the mesoderm. So make sure that, and that's the reason why it's not considered part of the skin technically. It's derived from different tissues. But it's essential because it anchors the skin to the underlying structures. It helps to insulate the body. So you have a layer of fat, varying thickness in this layer that helps keep stabilize your body temperature. And this layer, this fat actually has different distribution in different people and differs between males and females as well. And this hypodermis is composed of connective tissue, specifically areolar connective tissue, which we also find in the dermis, as well as adipose connective tissue, which is fat cells, right? If I say adipose connective tissue, it means the exact same thing as just saying fat cells. Questions here? And that's about, go back to your question, that's about all we're really going to talk about the hypodermis. And you'll see examples of this. We'll reference it often, but I'm not going to get into too much detail about its function. We're primarily going to focus on the dermis and epidermis. Cool. So let's take a look at what this actually looks like. You can see kind of a cutaway here of a layer of skin as well as the hypodermis. And this is a diagram from your textbook, so you don't have to worry about copying all this down now. You have this in your text. But you can see that we have the epidermis is here. The dermis is this thicker layer. Notice all the stuff that's going on in the dermis. Notice that it's vascularized. Notice that there's muscles there called erector pili. These are what makes your hair stand erect if you're cold or scared. Notice there's going to be some immune cells in there. There's nerves passing through, et cetera, et cetera. And then below that dermis, we have this additional layer of hypodermis. This is also called the superficial fascia. You saw this when you dissected or you skinned your cat earlier this week. And notice all of these yellow globules. These are all adipose cells or fat cells. So you can see the structure there. Takeaway message from here is that generally speaking, your epidermis is pretty thin, whereas your dermis is much thicker and has a lot more going on. There's a lot more action taking place. One other point, just to make the connection with what we talked about earlier this week, is that the epidermis is not vascularized. So there's no blood vessels going right into these cells. Rather, this dermal layer is highly vascularized, bless you, and this allows nutrients and things to be delivered to the epidermis because it's in close contact with that dermis layer. You might remember this from your lab guide as well. You can kind of see what this looks like and see the relative thickness of the layers kind of here. Epidermis, dermis, hypodermis. Then you have this deeper fascia, which is this connective tissue that surrounds your muscle. You got the muscle down there. So when you skin your cat, you're primarily pulling off the epidermis and the dermis, probably some of the hypodermis, and separating it from that deep fascia in the muscle. In some cases, you probably pulled this deep fascia off with your skin. In other cases, you probably separated it at the hypodermis, at that fatty layer, and left some of that fascia on your muscle. We'll get to that later in the semester. Clean up those cat muscles. Questions? All right, let's talk about the 5 functions of the skin. So 5 primary functions. The first is that it physically, it protects the underlying organs from a whole bunch of things. It protects it from physical contact with the outside world, bumps. It protects you from exposure to chemicals. It prevents water loss, and it also protects you from ultraviolet radiation from the sun. So it does all of these different forms of protection from different things that would injure your internal organs were they exposed to them. I'm just going to grab a drink here while you're copying that down. Next, the skin helps regulate body temperature. So I mentioned that the dermis layer is highly vascularized, and so there's this capillary network. And your body, when you are hot, let's say you're out at a practice in May and it's hot out, you're going to move a lot of blood out to your skin so that you can dump that heat off. In the wintertime, a day like today, you're walking to class, that blood moves away from the dermal layer and towards the core of your body to help reduce heat loss. In this case, like when you're coming to class this morning, you weren't feeling too hot, I'm guessing. The problem was you needed to stay warm. And so that blood is shunted away from these capillary beds in the skin towards the center of the body where it can stay warmer. That's why your hands and your feet are kind of the first thing to get cold. I mean, they're exposed more as well, but the blood flow is reduced to those organs in the cold. Our problem as humans is generally that we are too hot, not that we're too cold. Our main job when we think about thermoregulating, the challenge most of the time for us is to remain cool enough, not to keep ourselves hot enough. And to do that, we also sweat. And I'm going to talk about sweat glands here in a little bit. But humans, of all the things that we can do better than any other organism, there's kind of a short list, actually. There's everything can swim better than us, jump better than us, climb better than us. But I'll tell you what, we can sweat better than any other animal on this planet. We are world champion sweaters, humans are. So in many, many ways, the evolution of our body shape and our physical characteristics is shaped by the ability to run long distances. We can talk about this later in class. It's pretty fascinating. But we are really good at running really, really far. I mean, like 10, 20, 30, 40 kilometers. Humans can outrun. There's actually a race every year in Arizona in the desert where humans and horses race. And it's not unusual for humans to beat the horses in these long distance races. And part of the reason for that is we are super good at not overheating. Lots of other animals can run faster than us in a short distance, but they simply can't sustain it because they can't dump off heat like we can. And so if anyone ever asks you what you're really, really good at as a human being, you tell them sweating and calculus. Not many other organisms can do calculus. maybe not all of us. All right, excretion. Part of this is actually closely tied to temperature regulation, but urea, salts, and water are all lost through sweat. And so that's a way of eliminating. It's not as important an elimination mechanism as urine, but urea and salts are important for us to get rid of to maintain internal homeostasis. So the sweating helps with that. Our skin is awesome at producing vitamin D. So these epidermal cells, it's kind of a complicated chemical process that I don't even understand fully, but basically it can utilize UV radiation to synthesize vitamin D. And vitamin D is essential to, among other things, to help us absorb calcium from our diet. So if we don't get enough UV radiation, we don't synthesize enough vitamin D, we don't get enough calcium in our diet, that can have implications for bone health and structure especially, but also a number of other processes that are important. The vitamin D is important, getting that UV is important. And finally, the skin is important for sensory reception. So specifically, you have temperature. Oh, I have a good, let's make a note of this. The Nobel Prize last year actually went to folks who discovered some of the underlying mechanisms for detecting heat and detecting pressure in nerves in the skin. And so the epidermal layer is innervated, and there's cells that can detect pressure and temperature especially. And we have areas that are exquisitely sensitive to this. Also, there's a lot of nerve endings associated with the hair follicles. And so one of the ways we're most sensitive to the environment is actually not actually touching the skin itself, but touching hair. And those very, very, very light vibrations in your hair can be detected in the nerve cells that are associated with those hairs, which is kind of cool. That's your skin. That's what it does. Questions? All right. You guys ready for a game? It's not really a game. I should let me start that over. It's not a game. What is it? A battle. Dermis v. Epidermis. So this is what we're going to do. Instead of me lecturing about these two parts of the body, I am going to set up this activity. So there's a Google slide that's set up. I'll show you the link here in just a second. And what it contains, actually, I can, I'll just walk through this first. What it contains on the first page is a table, and then subsequently it has all of my lecture slides associated with the dermis and the epidermis. And instead of me lecturing, you're going to be on one of these two teams. You're going to be on Team Dermis or Team Epidermis. You're going to go to this, and you are going to fill out this table and with information about your layer, right? It's kind of summarized. You're going to go through those slides, find the information, and fill out that table. The table, you can just do it in your notes, or you can download a copy of slides onto your slide onto your computer and save it however you want to do it. And I'll provide this link for you as well. And then after 5 minutes, you're going to be paired with someone in the opposite group, and then you're going to teach them about your layer. You're going to tell them all about, let's say that you're in the dermis group, you're going to tell your partner all about the dermis, and they're going to be like, "Whoa, that's so cool." And then they're going to tell you all about the epidermis, and you're going to be like, "Wow, that's even cooler." And then like everyone's going to walk away from class super enlightened and happy. You can then decide which layer is best or more important. There's a variety of ways to settle that. It's an in-class activity worth 2 points. Sound good? Questions? Yes, please. You can actually, we could do it a couple ways. You can just copy the table into your notes, which would be really quick and easy to do it that way. Or you can actually go into Google Slides. You can save a copy of those slides. Like you can't modify those slides directly, but you can save your own personal copy of it and then do it that way. So whatever way suits you, it should be easy. All right, so here we go. I randomly shuffled the class list. You can see all of these folks are on Team Dermis. All these folks are on Team Epidermis. I've got a Gilmore Girls joke in there, which probably not everybody gets. Go ahead, here's the link to that, and go ahead and take first 5 minutes. You're just working on your own. So go ahead and do that. I'll go around and check in with you, and we'll see how things go. Don't feel rushed. If we need a little more time as a class, then we'll make that happen. All right, nice job, everyone. I saw some good exchange happening there. My idea with this activity is just to get us learning about this stuff in a way that's not me standing talking for the entire class and mix it up a little bit. Also, this way, now you have those slides. So you have access to all those slides. You can save those, get a chance to interact with some of your classmates. And the best way, really, to learn something is to teach it to somebody else. And you'll see later in the semester, I'll have you do activities at home where you teach your roommate or your friend or your cat all about certain concepts we cover in class. With that in mind, what questions do you have for me about anything before we move on and talk about the appendages of the skin? Question, yes.
What are the primary layers of the epidermis?
The primary layers of the epidermis. So that is in that slide here. Let me just show you. This slide is going to be the easiest thing. Sorry, just give me 1 second and I'll pull that up for you. Let me see if it comes over here. Nope. Just do this. Okay. So there's basically 4 primary layers of the epidermis. You have the stratum corneum, the stratum granulosum, the stratum spinosum, and the stratum basale. In all honesty, I'm not going to ask you too much details about these layers. It's covered in more detail in your readings in your textbook. that you have for Monday. What I do want you to know, especially though, is I'll give you some highlights. There's a highlight reel of the layers of the epidermis. The stratum corneum. Corneum comes from the word actually for horn, because this is made. These cells produce keratin. They're highly keratinized. Keratin is the same protein that's in your fingernails, also in things like the horn of a rhinoceros. So corn. Think about unicorn, single corn, single horn. That's the same root as corneum here. So it's a good connection between your epidermal layer and a mythical beast. Then we have the stratum granulosum is this kind of thin layer here in between. And then the stratum spinosum, this is where we have most of the thickness of your epidermis. And then the stratum basale is kind of at the bottom here. And this is where new epithelial cells are produced that kind of migrate outward. Notice that the stratum corneum, these cells are basically all dead. There's just layers and layers of these dead stratified squamous cells that produce this protective layer on the outside of your skin. I mentioned this a little bit in class the other day, is these are the scales that are constantly being shed off. And your textbook quotes that in your lifetime, you end up shedding like 40 pounds of these cells or something crazy. Like some ridiculous percentage of the dust that's in the air is all human epidermal cells from your stratum corneum. They slough off, new ones are produced underneath and migrate outward. So is Hannah, your question right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I just didn't get it from the other groups that are asking.
Sure.
I know I'm close.
Cool. No problem. All right. Any other questions? All right. Well, let's talk about the appendages of the skin. Let me go ahead and close this guy down and just go back to my PowerPoint.
What's your background picture of?
Oh, that's where I used to work. It's from a research lab. And so before I came to OU, I lived in France and did research there. And we had this research station at the top of this mountain. We would bring lizards up there to do experiments on lizards and snakes at high elevation. And this is actually out one of like the balconies kind of looking down. So this is the Pyrenees Mountains in Spain. The border between France and Spain is somewhere right in there. And you can see the only way up and down is this cable car. It was cool. It was beautiful. It was really neat. It was really neat. So every time I look at that, I go, oh, they don't have scenery like that in Ohio, I learned. All right. Did that, okay, oops, sorry. Okay, where are we? Appendages of the skin. So this includes three primary things we're going to talk about: nails, hair, and glands. So this is a lot of information about hair. Let me walk you through this. There's three main types of hair that you will grow throughout your lifetime. The first is what's called Lenugo. This is really, really fine hair that develops on a fetus before birth and is generally gone by the time the baby is born, unless they're born prematurely. So it's this really fine, unpigmented, so it's just kind of almost like a transparent color or like a white color, kind of downy hair that appears late during development. What's called the vellus replaces this Lenugo by birth and remains mostly on the human body. It's very fine hair, again, different from the hair that you normally see on other parts of your body. There's a few places where you retain it. I'm super lucky. I have a bunch of it on my scalp after one goes bald. So that's the little fuzzy hairs on the top of my head that are there because on my terminal hairs decided they'd rather live somewhere else. And then finally, terminal hair is what we generally, when you say hair, this is probably what you're thinking of. This is the hair on top of your head. This is the hair that grows for all of us in our axial region, so our armpits, as well as the groin region. For some folks, we get terminal hair growing on your chest and on your face and on your back, your legs especially. So all of the hair that you think about as normal hair is this terminal hair. So the three main kinds of hair. And we're going to focus most of our attention. I want you to know the three kinds of hair. And now we're going to talk about just terminal hair. We're not really going to say too much about the hairs early in life. Go ahead, Brooke. Yeah, actually, as I was saying that, I was thinking the same thing. Like, we understand pretty well why the terminal hair goes away, but I don't know, and I should look into this, me of all people, why the vellus hair actually comes back. I don't know the answer. That's a really good question, though. I'm gonna look that one up. Good. Anything else, True?
Maybe this is kind of quick, but what's the function of Lenugo hair that you would only need it during gestation?
So it provides, so it transitions to vellus by birth. And so when you're in the womb, you also have this kind of layer of this waxy goop on you as well. And it just protects you from abrasion from the amniotic fluid. And I think one of the roles of this is to provide additional protection of the developing fetus in the womb. As far as normal functions of hair, so hair is important, for example, for thermoregulation to retain warmth. That's not going to be important in that context. So beyond that, though, I'm not sure exactly what other role it might play. That's a good question. Why do we need to be hairy before we're born? All right, let's talk about terminal hair in a little more detail then. These are, as I said, this is what you think of when you think of hair generally. It's a strand of these dead keratinized cells. So they're these cells that are derived from your epidermis. And by the time you're seeing them and you're brushing and combing them, they are no longer alive. Now, these melanocytes, which are a kind of cell in the skin, actually they're derived from neural crest cells. So they have a little bit of a different origin than epidermal cells. Don't worry about that too much. But what happens is that these melanocytes produce this melanin that gets into these keratinized cells and gives it color. And the different kinds of melanin and the amount of it you produce determine your hair color. As you get older, these cells get less good at making melanin, and you kind of get hair bubble or air bubbles in your in the cells instead, and that makes your hair white or gray. And as you get older, yet basically all those melanocytes stop working, and you just end up getting white or gray hair. That's why you get white or gray hair as you get older. The main parts of the structure of the hair, I'll talk about these in detail, but let me just introduce you. The bulb is the bottom where we have the live cells that are producing this keratin and forming these strands. The root of the hair is embedded in the skin. I'll show you a diagram of that in a second. And the shaft is what actually comes out of the skin surface. So this is the part that comes out of the skin and is what we commonly call hair. So that looks like this. You can see the bulb down here. You can see the root is this hair, but it's still under the skin. And then the hair shaft is when it emerges from the skin. Another closely associated structure, and this is found in the dermal layer of your skin, are these kind of muscles called erector pili. They are smooth muscles, so they are involuntary, meaning you can't consciously control them. You can't like go and make your hair stand up on end. And what they do is under certain conditions, they contract and they pull your hair up so it's standing upright rather than just kind of flopped over against your skin. And so this happens especially when we're cold or scared or aroused. And so there's different factors can lead to those hairs getting pulled up. This is what produces what we call goosebumps, right? This is because all of those little muscles are contracting and it's kind of pulling up those hairs and creating those little kind of pockets on the skin, not pockets, but little protrusions on the skin, commonly called goosebumps. Now, for us humans, traditionally, by traditionally, I mean like in our closely related mammals that are closely related to us, pulling up these hairs would increase the volume of the hair surrounding your body, and it would therefore create more insulation to keep you warmer if you're cold, or make you look bigger if you're in the face of a predator. So anyone's had a cat, think about when your cat is alarmed, it puffs up its tail, it puffs up all its hair and makes itself look bigger. That's exactly the same thing. That is all your kitty's erector pili muscles pulling up those hairs to make it look bigger. And so it served a variety of functions in our closely related mammal ancestors and other mammal species, but it doesn't play as important a role for humans. We don't rely on our body hair as much for insulation as, say, a cat or a dog or basically any other mammal. that is a good place to stop. But before you pack up, let me just make a couple announcements here and see what questions you have. I'd like to end class on Fridays with a Venn diagram. But let me see what questions you have first. Don't worry about that slide. We'll get there. All right, here's the Venn diagram. Quiz number 1 is due on Monday. It's open right now. Actually, I set it to be open at 11, so it'll be open in a few minutes. Remember, this is a good one. I like this one. Remember that it is open book. Once you start it, you'll have 3 hours to complete it, but it should take 20-25 minutes. Otherwise, let me know if you have questions, and have a great weekend, everybody.